Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex topics and, well, give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Today, we're digging into a really critical geopolitical discussion. We're looking at a specific analysis and Israeli perspective on actions against Iran. So our mission is to cut through all the noise, get to the core arguments from this viewpoint, and give you a clear grasp of the strategic thinking behind Israel's actions, straight from this particular source.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is how deeply this perspective is rooted in, well, history and national identity. It frames these actions not really as aggression, but more as fundamental acts of survival. We'll dig into the specific threats they identify and, the justifications provided for the responses.
Okay, let's get right into the core of it then. The source, it pretty much immediately establishes Iran as what it terms the most significant and enduring existential threat to Israel. And this is a concern they trace all the way back to Israel's founding in 1948. It's deep-seated.
That's right. And this belief, this idea of an existential threat, it's presented as basically the bedrock of Israel's strategic doctrine. It's what drives, from this perspective, their commitment to preemptive action, to deterrence. So recent military operations, they're seen consistently as acts of survival. It's about securing the state's existence.
Right. So the source breaks down this Iranian threat into two main pillars from Israel's viewpoint. Anyway, let's start with the nuclear ambitions. What are the key concerns there?
Well, the document really highlights Israel's long-running, very careful monitoring of Iran's nuclear program. Now, Tehran insists it's peaceful, but the intelligence assessments cited both Israeli and shared ones. They suggest Iran has, well, at least pursued a path towards nuclear weapons capability at different times. And it points to specific things. Uranium enrichment up to 60% purity, which, is technically just a very short step from weapons grade. Also deploying advanced centrifuges, building these hardened underground sites like Fordo and Natanz, things the source argues just don't quite fit with a purely civilian program.
Okay, so if Iran did get nuclear weapons, what are the bigger strategic consequences Israel is worried about? Does it just completely change the game in the region from their point of view?
Oh, absolutely. Fundamentally, the source lists three major concerns. First, it predicts a pretty quick regional arms race. Think Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey. They might feel they need their own nuclear capabilities. Second, and this is really key, it would give Iran what's called a nuclear shield.
A nuclear shield. What does that actually imply for stability?
Well, it implies that once Iran has the bomb, they might feel kind of immune to conventional retaliation from Israel or maybe the U.S., and that could embolden them to ramp up support for their proxies, destabilize the region even more, without fearing a direct hit on their own territory. And third, the most critical point from this perspective, it would directly threaten the very existence of the Israeli state.
It's really interesting then how the source shifts from that direct nuclear threat to Iran's pretty extensive proxy network. How does that kind of shadow war factor in?
Yeah, it's a absolutely critical piece of the puzzle, according to this analysis. Iran, in this view, is actively funding, training, and arming this whole network of extremist groups that effectively encircle Israel, creating multiple fronts.
Like who specifically? Does it name them?
Oh, yeah. Specific examples are given. Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed, they say, with over 150,000 rockets pointed at Israeli civilians. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, responsible for thousands of rockets fired into Israel. And then you've got Syrian militias, the Yemeni Houthis, who are increasingly aligning with Iran's sort of broader military goals. The argument here is that these proxies are Iran's main way of waging asymmetric warfare.
Right. Keeping their own hands clean, so to speak.
Pretty much. It's seen as a deliberate strategy to destabilize the region, erode Israeli security, but avoid a direct fight between Iran and Israel or the West. If you look at the bigger picture, this lets Iran project a lot of power and influence without, rolling tanks across borders. It's a complex, pervasive challenge.
So given these threats as they see them, how does Israel actually justify its military actions? These actions are often unilateral, often draw international criticism.
Right. The source really anchors this justification in what's known as the Begin Doctrine.
Yeah.
This doctrine came out of the Osirak strike back in '81 under Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and it's pretty unambiguous. Israel will not allow an enemy state, especially in the Middle East, to get weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear ones. It's not just about deterring, it's about physically stopping the threat before it materializes. Preemption.
So this Begin doctrine, it's not just theory. The source points to actual history to back it up. But, for critics, those same historical actions look very different. How does this narrative frame them?
That's a really important point. The document explicitly mentions bombing Iraq's Osirak reactor in 81, the strike on Syria's nuclear site in Deir ez-Zor in 2007. These are presented as proof, basically, that the doctrine is real and has been acted upon. It also brings up more recent stuff, cyber attacks, drones, airstrikes targeting Iran's programs. From this perspective, waiting until Iran has the bomb is, and they state this very clearly, not an option.
Why not? What's the core rationale?
It comes down to geography and demographics. Israel's small size, its concentrated population means even one nuclear strike could be utterly catastrophic. So that reality, the source argues, makes preemption less of a choice and more of an existential necessity.
Okay. Is Israel going it alone here, or does the source talk about coordination with others?
No, not entirely alone. It actually details quite a bit of strategic coordination with allies. The U.S. is mentioned prominently, of course, but also sometimes coordination with Arab partners like the UAE or Saudi Arabia. It even suggests the Abraham Accords were partly motivated by this shared concern about Iran. And the military actions themselves, they're consistently described as, calculated, limited, based on intelligence. The framing is that they aren't reckless escalations, but precise responses.
But surely these actions have risks. I mean, big risks. Does the source acknowledge the downsides?
It does, yeah. It's pretty candid about the risks Israel recognizes. Things like sparking wider regional retaliation, facing international criticism, increasing the danger to its own civilians from potential Iranian missile strikes or, say, cyber attacks. However, and this is the core message running through it, the belief is that inaction carries a far, far greater risk. An intolerable one, essentially. It points to what it sees as Iran's consistent expansionism, its genocidal rhetoric.
Does it give examples of that rhetoric?
Yes, it specifically mentions the phrase, Israel is a cancer that must be removed. And it couples that with Iran's advancing technological capabilities. From this viewpoint, all that just leaves no room for complacency. The risk of not acting is seen as the ultimate danger.
There's that quote mentioned from Prime Minister Netanyahu. We will not allow those who seek our destruction to obtain the tools to carry it out. What really stands out to you about that specific phrasing?
Well, that quote, we will not allow those who seek our destruction to obtain the tools to carry it out, it's more than just tough talk, isn't it? It really captures a specific strategic mindset. For them, the trigger for action isn't just about an enemy getting the capability, like the weapon itself. It's about the enemy's stated intent combined with, lessons learned from history about waiting too long. It implies this sort of zero-sum game where stopping a threat before it's fully formed isn't just one option. It's perceived as the only viable path to survival, even with the immediate risks involved. It really echoes that deep-seated commitment to never again.
Does this perspective just see endless conflict ahead? Or is there some kind of desired end state for the region? A vision for stability?
The source is clear that the goal isn't endless war or trying to dominate the region. Instead, it talks about wanting a secure Middle East, one that's free of nuclear weapons, free of extremism. This vision includes, mutual recognition, normalization with neighbors, and ideally, an Iran that acts like a normal member of the international community, not a revolutionary state trying to dominate the region.
What about diplomacy? Things like the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. The document notes Israel has supported diplomatic solutions like the JCPOA, but with a big caveat, only if they come with solid, verifiable compliance and real consequences for cheating. It explains that from their perspective, after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA and Iran ramped up its enrichment again, there seemed to be very few alternatives left besides targeted action. So if we sort of zoom out, look at the bigger picture presented here, Israel's actions against Iran are framed fundamentally by a principle of defense. It's about defense, not domination.
And the source makes that really powerful link to history, doesn't it? Referencing millennia of Jewish persecution, the Holocaust still being such a fresh memory, really underlining that core idea of never again.
Exactly. From this specific viewpoint, hitting Iranian nuclear or military targets preemptively isn't seen as some casual choice. It's presented as a moral imperative, a strategic necessity, a duty, really, to protect millions of lives and the future of what they see as the world's only Jewish homeland.
So what does all this mean for you, listening? Maybe consider how these deep historical experiences, these intense geographical realities, can profoundly shape a nation's entire strategic way of thinking. And then how that doctrine affects everything else. Regional stability, the calculations of global powers. What are the long-term consequences of a strategy so focused on preemptive survival, especially in such a complex, volatile neighborhood? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Subscribe for more.